My new book is here. It is the follow up to my best selling book on skill acquisition, How We Learn to Move. My new book is called Learning to Optimize Movement, Harnessing the Power of the Athlete Environment Relationship. If you think about how we learn to move, was understanding basic coordination. The basic coordination of skill acquisition, how we learn to move and control our body to achieve our goals, touching on basic principles like variability, constraints, attractors, things like that. So, what I want to do in this book is go beyond that to the next level. The first thing we need to do to be skillful is generate a useful coordination pattern. Next, we want to optimize that coordination pattern to make it more effective, to make it more efficient, to make it work under a broader range of conditions and be adaptable, etc., and so on. So that's my goal in this book. Try to understand optimization, how we can get the best out of ourselves. I wanted to provide practical coaching tips and some tools. So the tips, almost every chapter you'll see ends with what are the implications for coaching section. So over the past year or so since I wrote my first book, I have been championing this approach and consulting and working out with a lot of different people. And through it, I have kind of come up with, they're not all just mine. I've identified some tools that I find very effective for applying this method and getting you to think about it. Obviously, in this book, I'm taking a certain approach to skill, and in it, I'm highlighting the importance of looking at the whole brain body environment system. So there's intelligence throughout this system. The direct information we can pick up that gives us so much useful things about that we need to control our movements. And the intelligence within your body's ability to use tension and restructure itself. It has so much in self-organize itself, right? It's not just following the commands of your brain. If you establish an appropriate information movement relationship with your environment, you're picking up the appropriate information, the specifying information, you're using it for the right way to control your movements, you're adapting it, you're well calibrated, then you're going to get so many things. Subtitle of the book, Harnessing the Power of the Athlete Environment Relationship. In this chapter, you start with William Mace's famous quote, ask not what's inside your head, but your head is inside of. This is basically a discussion of the ideas of direct perception. I'm trying to convince you about all this wonderful information out there and kind of the intelligence within your body, its ability to self-organize. In the second chapter, I really dig into information. And I use the analogy of the matrix, right? I think in many of the sports we coach and things we do, we've created this matrix. The idea that everything is so complicated and ambiguous and not very understandable in our environment, and we need to interpret it and process it, figure out what it is. In fact, there's tons of direct information just waiting there, right? So in this chapter, I'm going to go through a variety of different information sources relative to sports. For example, as shown in this picture, I'm going to talk about David Lee's idea of coupling taus, right? We'll talk about optic flow, all these kind of things. So I'm really trying to do a deep dive into understanding what information is, what specification is. So the first three chapters, I kind of loosely group them as perceiving, right? So I'm talking about pulling in information. The third chapter, I'm going to talk about eye movements, right? Talk about optimizing the control of gaze. What do we know about where elite athletes look? What are their different strategies? What can we do about that? How can we design practice? I'm going to convince you it's very important you're looking in the right place. Number 4, I'll talk about attention. I'll really dive into, of course, the internal versus external attention research and use of analogies, things like that, talking a lot about my research, what I've done over the years. Why does internal attention tend to hurt performance? I'm going to give my 2 cents on the practical use of internal versus external cues. I do not believe that you should never use internal cues. I'm going to give you kind of my practical advice from both the research side and applying this on when and how you should use the different types of cues in instructing your athlete. The next few chapters, I want to focus on the movement side of the coin, right? I'm breaking them apart in terms of the description. Obviously, we don't break them apart. They're coupled, right? So number 5, I'm going to talk about perspective control. This alternative, wonderful way that we can control our movement without having to predict. Could make something happen in the future, like catching a Frisbee, without predicting where the Frisbee is going to be and when, right? And the answer is yes, we can with this wonderful tool called perspective control. So I really want to dive into this and get you to try to understand what exactly does this mean. I know it's a bit of a tricky concept. I'll give you some examples of it. How do we run to catch a Frisbee? We'll talk about dogs catching frisbees, some interesting research on that, and how can we get our athletes to do this. Number 6, we'll look at more at affordances. I'm going to call this affordance-based coaching. We'll talk about the difference between what I define a capacity versus a skill. My main goal in this chapter is to get you to convince you that the really effective way to coach is to get your practice environment to do the talking for you. We'll talk about this example of a door handle, right? The affordance offered by a handle sticking out from a door is pulling. A push sign is an explicit instruction. Often what we do in practice is we tell athletes what to do verbally. Affordances, opportunities for action. We make some of the opportunities for action more amplified or salient, right? And I'll talk about how exactly we can do this. Chapter 7, I'm going to get into the topics of muscle tension, muscle slack, and biotensegrity. What happens before you move is as important as what happens while you're moving. This is one of Franz Bosch's ideas, which is Bernstein also talked a lot about. Removing slack and getting the appropriate tension, maintaining the structure of your body through this wonderful principle of biotensegrity, how you can create internal forces to balance and respond to perturbations, like in basketball, stepping on someone else's foot. How can we make an athlete better able to respond to those, right? Chapter 8, I want to talk about something we often overlook when talking about skill acquisition is the issues of efficiency and economy. How can we have an effective movement solution that also does not use as much energy, so we don't get fatigued that quickly, have more energy in the fourth quarter at the end of the game, so in the 9th inning? So I want to talk about some research on movement efficiency and economy, how we can measure it using some tools, and how we can get our athletes to become more efficient movement. The next set of chapters I've called adapting, right? How can we make our movement, our solutions more adaptable to different environments so they work under different constraints and so on. And in chapter 9, I'm going to talk about skilled intentionality, which is the idea of keeping a lot of options open, keeping a lot of available affordances open. I often use the example of a 2-on-1 in sports like hockey or basketball. What we want to do as an athlete is move not just to achieve our goal, but to keep as many options, shooting, passing, driving to the goal, keep them open as long as possible. And I introduced the idea of deciding slow, right? We think about fast decision making as being good. It's not always, right? I think as important as moving itself. If you move, have skilled intentionality, you're getting a lot of envelopes delivered to you. Metastability is it's having a lot of letter openers, right? So it's having a lot of different ways to achieve the same goal. Instead of having just one way to catch a ball or one type of punch to use in a fight, right? Metastability is moving so as to keep lots of different ways to achieve the same goal: a punch, a jab, an uppercut, and the idea of exploiting motor abundance, so having lots of different movement solutions. In chapter 11, I'll go into the topic of team coordination, getting into the idea that this is achieved through shared affordances, having your athlete pick up the same imitations from the environment at the same time, and how we can achieve this through practice design, talking about some research. Chapter 12, I'm going to get into this kind of sticky issue for the ecological approach, is using what's called offline information. So instead of using information that's directly available in the moment, like tau and optic flow and all these wonderful things, how can I use information from the event history? So if a pitcher throws me 3 fastballs in a row, the team I'm playing against in football has 3 running plays in a row. Obviously, that's useful information that we want to incorporate into our movement solution, not just have to rely on the in the moment. And we can do that, right, very easily, without having to resort to thinking about prediction and mental models. And I'll also talk about a very, very different view of what we're doing with the advanced cues we get from our opponent, their body language as they're throwing or serving a ball. So I'll talk about very different views on how we can think about these things and how we can coach them. The last few chapters, I'm talking about strength. We have these good information control laws. We've adapted them to different environments by keeping multiple options open, using offline information like event history. Now we want them to make them strong against things that are going to try to break apart this relationship. The first one I'm going to talk about is pressure and emotion, right? What causes choking under pressure? I present a lot of ideas for how you can add pressure to your practice, how you can make your practices hot, having an emotional component to them instead of cold. So I present a lot of practical information based on the research, which I think is a really, really valuable thing to do. Chapter 14 will talk about the difficulty of a task. And the really critical question I get from a lot of coaches: how difficult should practice be? We'll talk about this really kind of fairly simple way to address this, the 70% rule. And then we'll dive into more of the details of it, looking at the challenge point hypothesis, this trade-off between performance in the moment and learning in the long run. Right? How can we challenge level and practice so we're not breaking our athlete apart by getting them demotivated and feel like they're a failure? At the same time, we're challenging them enough so they fail sometimes and learn. Chapter 15, I'm going to talk about pain and injury. I'm going to revisit the idea I had in How We Learn to Move that we need to think of in terms of adaptation, not rehabilitation, going back. I'll talk about some newer research, talk about some different, like the Feldenkrais method for training movement as opposed to traditional physical therapy. What does pain do to an athlete's the way they self-organize, and how can we deal with that? And then I'll introduce this fascinating concept of anti-fragility, stressors we have in our environment, but that can actually make us stronger in the long run. They can make our skill even more powerful and strong and stable. The last chapter are some of the tools I like to use to support practice design. Tools for designing constraints, designing cues, for tracking variability, to assessing how representative your practice is. Feedback from talking with a lot of different coaches that they find useful. I hope you enjoy it and keep them coupled.